We are joined by Director of Analytics for Argonaut Hockey Group, Nick Lacoste. Nick has a lot of positions in a lot of different areas in the hockey industry. He is also a staff writer for Blackout Dallas, a site that writes about the Dallas Stars, a staff writer for Flames Nation. He's a qualitative and quantitative analyst for the Indigenous Hockey Research Network. He's also a video analyst and analytics consultant, I suspect, for an OHL team that we can't tell you which one. He also is a Brock graduate, 2023. He's actually taken the course that you're taking right now. He sat in a physical classroom, I believe, at that point, though, right, Nick?
Yeah.
Now, Nick, give us a sense here of your experience in the scouting industry. When did you first start scouting and looking at hockey players and doing player analysis?
My player analysis journey, you could call it, began in grade 10. It was part of the same time where I was thinking about what I wanted to do in career classes and everything. So I really found sort of a love for sport and hockey and realized that there are jobs in sport and there are jobs in hockey specifically that would meet my interest in both analytical mindsets as well as being able to watch hockey games. So further to that experience, I was able to sort of work in analytics in high school and build my own personal databases. And that's sort of what sort of built my interest in analytics. But I realized quickly that scouting was a huge part of the industry, and watching players and understanding how players move, sort of the qualitative versus the quantitative, was a huge balancing act for me during high school. I came from a background that was less hockey related because I started hockey in about grade 8, grade 7, maybe like major Pee Wee, I believe was my first year. So I was not one of those guys who grew up in hockey. Maybe I didn't have any AAA experience. I played mostly house league and select, so I was more of a recreational player. But I was so fond of watching hockey, studying hockey, and tracking hockey for that matter as well. So that became sort of why I chose Brock Sport Management and why I found that scouting was a huge part of what has made me successful so far in the years following Brock Sport Management.
That's a fantastic bit of background there, and I think a lot of people in this class and throughout Brock have that same sort of background that you do, and are driven by a passion for the game, and then that's you're an excellent example of how to leverage that passion into actually working in the field. Now, you mentioned something that's I think a very important corollary as we discuss the scouting process itself. You mentioned this sort of qualitative, the quantitative, seeing people in person, seeing people on video. Would you describe, is there a difference between scouting on video and scouting in person? And if there is a difference, how have you experienced that difference?
There are a couple key differences between scouting on video and scouting in person from my personal experience. When you're in person, I find to be very involved in the game. I like the sounds of the live environment personally. As a scout, you're listening for a lot of things. You're looking at the players themselves. Hopefully, you pick a small quantity of players to look at. You're not going to scout a whole team. If you can scout maybe 2 to 3 guys, you can focus on each of their shifts individually and have a better grasp of what they're doing. But when I'm live, I like to be near the glass or even spend part of the game down by the glass and then go up into the stands to have a different viewpoint of players. Because when you look on video, you're seeing through one lens, figuratively and literally. So you're looking through one camera angle most of the time. I do like when broadcasts for higher level hockey show, like, for example, behind the net cams to see the in zone plays. Those are very creative. There are very creative players in the O zone and the D zone. So I like to see certain schemes and how players react to changes in those schemes, whether it be defensive coverages or offensive plays, for example. A lot of NHL teams and high level teams will run specific plays. And if players are able to execute that in the O zone or the D zone, success can be found. So I like to see if players are able to follow a system or if they're creative on their own front. But with regards to video versus in person, I do find that video is a good thing to look back on. I like to record things in person if I can, like if I can videotape someone's shift and look back at it and compare my live thoughts to my video thoughts. But in general, video is usable. Video is fine. Video, you can learn a lot about players from video as well as just the box scores. That's what a lot of people look at, especially with younger kids, because of how many people are going through the system. There are thousands and thousands of hockey players all over the world that are trying to reach the same goals, which is pro hockey or the NHL. So if you're looking at so many players, you don't have enough time to necessarily scout everybody in person. But I find that a good combination of in-person and video is helpful.
Excellent point. And so you described this sort of video scouting process, and maybe some of these students have done it themselves. Maybe some of them are thinking about it. Maybe they're curious about it, maybe for hockey or other sports. One of the sort of rude awakenings that await you when you head into this world of video scouting is generally what you mentioned before. You're not getting 4K 360-degree views half the time. Sometimes you're getting some pretty grainy streams, some pretty nasty looking videos that you're going to see. I'm sure, Nick, you've seen quite a few of them in your day. Some of them look like little doorbell cameras that have been installed somewhere in the arena. It's straining the eyes, zooming in. It's tough. What are some pieces of advice you'd have when someone's trying to scout on video when they're first starting out?
When you're first starting out on video, it'd be a good idea to look at a whole team and be able to watch a full game of that team before you look at certain players. Many players might look the same. They might all have white tape. They might all have the same color cages. They might have similar skating strides. But it's important to look at who differentiates themselves during the games. Who is a better accelerator? Who is more agile in zone? Who, for example, if a defenseman has trouble skating backwards, if you notice little tidbits like that, looking for keys like that will separate you as a scout from other scouts. Everyone can say, wow, he's a good shooter, he's a good skater. But certain little tidbits about the way they skate, maybe the way they shoot, do they bring the puck into their skates when they shoot, or do they pull it outside before they shoot? Certain things like that. Studying the sort of the novelties of player archetypes is what I would like to call them, like how they play as a player, is something that I like to include in scouting reports, and video is a great way to use that. Even in the tough situations, it's able to, if you look for differentiating players, it's a good idea.
You've actually led us into our next topic perfectly. You said that you'd like to include them in your scouting reports. So this begs the question, what do you mean? What is a scouting report? How would someone who wants to get involved in the scouting world build a scouting report? What's your advice to them? Because I'm sure you've started out one way, you've tried different ways. You've probably had times in which you've compiled more information than you was needed, or you wanted more and needed to go back later. How do you build a scouting report? What advice would you give our students that are looking to build their first scouting reports?
First of all, I do some research on some popular numerical scales. There's a lot of times where people will overvalue some certain players because they're not familiar with how to build a scale. I would like to say that if you give someone a 1 to 5 scale on all of their traits, for example, shooting, skating, for example, I like to do 3 as average compared to the peers. So, for example, if Connor McDavid skating, it would be a 5 because he is better than every player in the NHL, arguably, at skating. But someone an average player in the NHL would be a 3 compared to NHL peers, but they are obviously better than someone who's in U16 right now playing AAA. So it's going to be difficult when you're trying to scout different leagues of different ages. But if you're focusing on players like U16 players, which are the players that are going to be drafted by, for example, OHL clubs in Ontario primarily, U16 AAA is a great place to sort of narrow your scouting lens and look towards simply 15-year-olds that are aspiring to be in those high-level environments. While you're building a scouting plan, I look to build a scouting plan of 1 to 5 scales on many of the traits that you're thinking of, whether it be hockey IQ, shooting, or skating. I'd also look to have brief explanations of how they play. I would rather you not explain the ratings in your scouting brief, because they're going to infer, whoever reads your briefs is going to infer from the numbers that they're a good skater. If you have something specific to say about someone skating, for example, like if they use a lot of crossovers, if they're agile, if they are better with the puck than without the puck, or if they're better without the puck than with the puck, contribute that into your brief to make the best use of your words, rather than simply stating this guy's an electric skater, because if you give him a 5 at skating compared to his peers, people are going to understand that.
Excellent advice there, especially when it comes to imagining your audience is another important part of what you just mentioned there. I mean, you're essentially saying here, saying electric skater. I mean, without giving some sort of notion of context, or especially if you're going to already have a rating system involved as well. You also mentioned an important part there at the beginning there when you were describing, look, understand the peer group seems to be an important part of this sort of scouting world as well. Don't be comparing these U15 players, these U16 players to the NHL as you saw playing for the Leafs last night. That doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't do anyone any good. Comparing them, well, he's not as good as Connor McDavid. If that was the way that people scouted in every sport, that wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? I mean, we'd be evaluating on fractional notions of value compared to for NHLers, which leads us to our next important point here, which is that about sample. So you've made your scouting report. You have a good sense of what a numerical value is. You've probably also looked around and tried to figure out, what a good stride looks like. You've done all the pre-work. You're here. You've seen. Now you've got video in front of you. You've watched a game, or you've been in person, or you've done both. How do you know when you have a good enough sample? Like, and what does that even mean, Nick, in this context?
A sample to me is the amount of games or times you're going to watch a player to understand how he does in good and bad situations. You could get lucky. You could get 3 games of this a player's best 3 games of their whole season. They could have a lot of points. They could have goals. They could be active in the ozone for as a forward, for example. But that might not encapsulate the entire player's profile. So what I like to do is I like to look, if you are able to and you have access to, find online, look at the box scores of players depending on the league you're in and the resources available to you, and look for games where they have 0 offensive opportunities versus when they have many offensive opportunities. Look for games where the team loses. Look for games where the team wins. And if you find those games have similar outputs on your scouting for a certain player, then that consistency should be rewarded in your briefs, and that should be a player that you should vouch for if you think they're going to be consistently good, no matter the outcome of the team. Because many players can be put in separate environments, and in a vacuum, they can look great. But maybe if they play on a bad team, but they're still great, they might not get noticed as much. So I would like to look for a sample, perhaps let's say 3 to 5 games of players. I would like to watch a full game if you're able to, through certain softwares. If you work for certain teams, there are shift tools to be able to watch just their shifts. That's a really good way of use of your time, is to watch just the players' shifts, because when the rest of the players are on the ice, it's not as important to your scouting briefs. You shouldn't be worrying about that too much. You should be taking a break because your eyes are going to be so focused on so many hockey players moving back and forth. It may be difficult to sort of focus back when the guy gets on the ice again. But overall, I'd say a good sample between in-person and video would be 3 to 5 games of player shifts at least. Or if you watch the full game, you may have a better sense of how they play against their peers.
Great point there with regards to the context of the game itself. So if you're already hunting for past games and you have the ability to watch on video, selecting games based on outcomes and based on individual outcome performances, sometimes those box scores aren't as easily or aren't as readily apparent. But another thing to keep in mind also, that with regards to what you were saying here, is if you don't have a team that you're working for right now, you can still replicate these practices if no one's asking you to do it with National Hockey League players. You can do this that's, I think, one of the easiest ways to get started, especially if you have access to watching past games of NHL players, or even just sort of individual plays on YouTube. If you want to get your feet wet in this regard, and this is also true in other sports as well, keep that in mind, that eventually you'll get to a place in which you'll have a team that's asking you to do this, but at the start you might not. And it might be helpful to do exactly what Nick's saying, but just sort of on your own volition with players that you're curious about, rather than waiting for a team to ask you. Because one of the important problems is how do you get that team to sort of say, look, Nick, we want you to look at these players for us if you don't have a record of having done it before for any other reason? How would you know necessarily if a player's stride is efficient, or if his shot is deceptive, or any of these sorts of things, if you not have a record of demonstrating that you have that knowledge at all? So again, if you're looking to get started in the scouting world, I guess something that me and Nick have talked about previously in the past is just start scouting. Just start doing it. Whether or not someone's asking you to do it or not, get your feet wet. Do all the things that Nick is telling you without waiting for a team to do it for you, to ask you to do it on their behalf. Leads us to our last question for this particular little chat that we've had here, which is the notion of, okay, you have a good sample. Now you've picked out those 3 games that are representative, I think, of the highs and lows of a season, which makes sense given what a season can be like. When do you stop? When do you say, okay, I have enough information? Do you have to watch every single shift of a player for an entire season? When do you know, okay, I'm ready to stop?
It comes down to, first of all, it comes down to personal comfortability with the players. If you're surrounded by U16 hockey, for example, if that's your focus for the year of OHL draft eligible players, if you've been around sort of like maybe 20 to 30 games throughout the fall, you're going to get a sense of a lot of different players, and you're going to get a sense of which players you've scouted compared to each other. And if that sense of personal comfortability is there, that might be a good place for you to sort of dial back the time you spent driving to those arenas or watching a lot of video. In another sense, you could look at, maybe you should never stop watching a player. Maybe a player is sort of a question mark for you. What does this player mean to me? What is he worth something? Is he going to be good in a different league? Is he better than what he's doing right now? If you have questions about a player, I would like to keep watching him, because I'm always curious about, is this player going to meet my expectations or exceed my expectations based on what I've seen previously. After a certain sample, though, like I said, with 3 to 5 games worth of shifts, you get a certain sense of players. And if you're hoping to scout multiple players throughout the year and build sort of like any rankings or any sense of lists, I would like to manage my time wisely as well, because I'm sure most of you are trying to focus on school and jobs and other, things to work on throughout the year. So I would focus more so on, if you're going to build a full list of people, work on your 3 to 5 game samples and see if that meets your standard of what a good player scouting brief is.
Nick, thank you for your time, and we'll hear more from you this semester. And thank you so much for all this wonderful pieces of advice you've given here.
Thank you for having me.